Good evening and welcome everybody to the fourth in our series of the History of Web Medicine webinar series hosted by RCSI Bahrain. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all today, and I hope that you enjoy this presentation. Could I have the next slide, please? Nevin, next slide, please. So we put together a very interesting webinar, and we hope that you will not only enjoy today, but we hope that you will join the rest of the series, which will be held on the date, so we can send this to you in due course. Next slide, please. Just to remind you that if you have any questions, that you use the question and answer function, which is on top of your screen with a little question mark, to write in, and we'll get to you hopefully in this session. But if not, then we'll try to answer your questions by email. Next slide, please. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Professor Gabriel Fox. Professor Fox is a consultant pediatrician, pediatric intensivist at King Hamad University Hospital. He joined us on staff in 2015, and at the same time joined us here as a senior lecturer at RCSI. He has recently been promoted to associate professor. He graduated in 1980 from University College Dublin, and after a brief dalliance with surgery and pathology, found his true vocation and calling in pediatrics. He devoted the rest of his postgraduate career to pediatrics and was a consultant pediatrician in the west of Ireland in Castlebar from 1988. He has multiple publications, and his major interest is in that of the autonomic nervous system in newborns and infancy. He has a special interest in developmental delay and developmental abnormalities of childhood. He also has a history in the medical history, in the medical history of Dublin, and that is his topic today, the Irish influence on the 1832 cholera epidemic. So without further ado, I'll turn you over to Professor Fox.
Thank you, Professor Martin. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. And given the times, we're going to talk about an epidemic, another unprecedented epidemic, but one that's actually had 7 pandemics over the last 200 years. Can I have the next slide, please, Nevin? When we have a problem, it's interesting to see how one goes about dealing with it. In this case, the problem for today is how do we get the goat to market? This is actually something that was invented to bring the goat to market, and in its day it actually worked. But along the next hour or so, we'll actually talk about other things that were tried that worked in different ways. Next slide, please. We're going to bring you through a few different places, from the realms of fantasy to the Angel of the North, and along the way a couple of films on train. Next slide, please, Nevin. And we're going to start back with the days of Hippocrates, who actually, Hippocrates had this theory that basically life was self-healing. There's no truth in the rumor that the guy at the back is me. I know I've been around for a long time, and some people have thought that I'm the fella in the corner of the picture, but that's not quite true. Next slide, please. We're going to go from Hippocrates to the times of Dominic Corrigan. And along the way, hopefully we'll meet some other characters in our travels. Next slide, please. When I came here in 2015, one of the things that actually was done soon after I arrived, that the cholera was spreading from Iraq through Syria into Kuwait and was due to arrive in Bahrain. Next slide, please. In fact, there was 2 cases of Bahrain that year. Both did very well, both treated in Salmonella, both went home well. But at the same time in Dublin, while they were digging the loose line, which was a tram line at the time, they found victims' bones from the cholera epidemic of 1830. Next slide, please. In 2007, according to WHO, there were 56,000 cases of cholera worldwide. In 2017, just after these cases were reported, there was 200,000 in Yemen, accounting for 1,500 deaths, of which a quarter were children. Next slide, please. Yemen has other problems at the moment with poverty, hunger, limited access to healthcare, dealing with other problems such as malaria, dengue and diphtheria. COVID has a very little small place in its overall worries. Next slide, please. But because of these problems, a child getting COVID in Yemen at the moment is 10 times more likely to die from that disease. Next slide, please. In the first 10 months of 2020, there was 204,000 cases of cholera in the Yemen, with 53 associated deaths. Next slide. But every 10 minutes, a child is dying in Yemen from either starvation or cholera. Next slide, please. So we'll go back to the immortal Sydenham in 1669, who originally talked about cholera. And cholera comes from the word bile, and bile to flow. And Sydenham had the theory that in order to treat cholera, you used a treatment that was made to dilute the acrid bile and to render its discharge more easy. And cathartic should be used along with large volumes of broth derived from whole chickens. Next slide, please. Cholera is an acute secretory diarrhea caused by infection of Vibrio cholera of the either 01 or 0139 serogroup. It's endemic in more than 50 countries worldwide, and since 1817, there have been 7 pandemics. The last one in 1961 killed 5 million people. Between 1817 and 1857, 50 million people worldwide died from cholera. Next slide, please. The management of the patients involves aggressive fluid replacement. Effective therapy can reduce the mortality from 50% to less than 0.2. Antibiotic treatment decreases this further, but prevention of cholera is probably more important, and this depends on access to safe water and sanitations. At the moment, there are 2 oral cholera vaccines available. Next slide, please. As regards to the history of cholera, while the original cholera epidemic was in 1817, this didn't get as far as Europe. The first one in Europe was 1831 to 32, which accounted for 22,000 deaths. 1848 to 1849 with 54,000 deaths, and 1853 to 54 saw the start of Jon Snow's work. Next slide, please. The presentation is what's described as rice water diarrhea. Next slide, please. It's the oldest disease affecting humans, and 20% of those affected develop acute watery diarrhea. As said previously, it can cause as high as a 50% mortality if case management is not adequate. But with treatment, this death rate can be as low as less than 1%. Next slide, please. The Vibrio cholera is divided into 2 main serogroups. Vibrio cholera 01, which is either classical or the L. Torv biotype, and this is the one that actually was responsible for the 1960s pandemic, and 01139, which was first identified in India in 1992. Next slide. The risk factors involve poor social economic factors, poor sanitation, high population density with camps and slum populations are highly vulnerable, underlying disease such as malnutrition, chronic disease, HIV and AIDS, and environmental and seasonal factors. Next slide, please. Infected persons, symptomatic or not, can carry and transmit Vibrios from 1 to 4 weeks, and a small number of individuals can remain healthy carriers for several months. Next slide, please. The Vibrio cholerae accumulates in the stomach, produces toxins which divide to G protein receptors, working through GTPase, increasing cyclic AMP. This activates the ion channels, causing sodium chloride influx into the intestinal lumen and drags water with it, and this leads to the watery diarrhea. Next slide, please. The symptoms, as mentioned already, is profuse watery diarrhea, stomach cramps, leg pains, mild fever, vomiting, sunken eyes and cheeks, dry mucous membranes, and decreased urinary output. Next slide, please. The big problem with cholera, as opposed to normal diarrhea and other infective causes of diarrhea, is the high concentration of sodium, potassium, chloride, and bicarbonate in both adult and children's stools. Next slide, please. Poor sanitary conditions are rare in developed countries but common in Asia, Africa and Latin America. Raw and uncooked food, particularly contaminated seafood, even in developed countries, especially shellfish. Hyperchlorhydria, low levels of stomach acid and type 0 blood group. Next slide, please. Management is oral rehydration therapy, intravenous fluids and antimicrobial therapy. And oddly enough, a lot of this was around in the 1870s. Next slide, please. Robert Koch is reputed to have discovered the organism in 1883. He was already famous for his discovery of tuberculosis. Next slide, please. But in fact, in the 1960s, Filippo Puccini was reputed to have discovered it already in 1854, but wasn't recognized until 82 years after his death as actually having found the organism. Next slide, please. The spread in pandemics usually starts in Southeast Asia and extends from there. This is an example from the 1960s and 70s, the last pandemic, where it spread rapidly, and this was helped by air travel for the first time. Prior to that, in the 5th and 6th cholera epidemics, the Suez Canal was actually responsible for its rapid spread, and before that, the spread was somewhat easier contained. Next slide, please. Going back to the original spread started in the Bay of Bengal around the excuse me, my brain's going. Next slide, please. Okay, starting in the area of Jessore, heading down into Calcutta, Madras, and from there down to Ceylon or Sri Lanka. A stop. It extended across to Bombay and then followed one of two routes, either the army route extending through Afghanistan and up into the Russias, or heading from Bombay by sea. Sea travel had become more common, and this was one of the reasons why it spread so well. The other problem at the time was that armies tended to spread this bug, and it was more common in areas where there was wars and pestilence. It came to the attention of the forces in England because in one particular army outcamp, 10,000 British soldiers died in 1817 during the first outbreak, and this brought it to the attention of the government back in England. Next slide, please. The spread originally in 1817 spread from Bombay to Muscat, and from there to Basra, and Basra to Baghdad, to Tehran, and to Mecca. At that stage, it seems to stop around the area of the Mediterranean and was locally endemic in that particular area and the area around the Middle East for about 5 years with no further spread. Bahrain at the time seemed to be immune from it, and this seemed to be due to what was described as the fresh waters of Dilmun, which was local water, which was non-contaminated. It was spread mainly by sailors and by soldiers, and was spread to Muscat by the British Army, which had a large force in Muscat at the time. The next spread from there spread from Baghdad and Tehran up into Moscow, and from there to St. Petersburg. It extended into Poland, where there was a major war going on between Russia and Poland and the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the time. And the first evidence of germ warfare was used where dead bodies of soldiers dead from cholera were actually fired by cannons into various areas to infect the local community. It spread by boat up through the Mediterranean, and from St. Petersburg it spread to Hamburg. Hearing of this expected problem at the time, the British Board of Health set up a company that would look at this, and two notable doctors at the time, Barry and Russell, were sent to St. Petersburg to investigate this. Part of the report at the time said that whatever germ caused this, number one, was not contagious, but secondly, was spread by boats and by barges. At the time, though, two German doctors that were part of the company investigating this, Jasbeck and Breslau, discussed why a certain little old lady in St. Petersburg seemed to be have got cholera more than once and seemed to survive. And she described that her doctor basically made her bleed with leeches and by lancing, and then made her drink copious amounts of water and 2 tablespoons of salt a day. This was to prove later on somewhat insightful. From Hamburg, the bug spread both to Paris and also in 1831 it arrived in England. Next slide, please. This shows that essentially it spread widely from not only up into England and Ireland, moving on to the States and Canada, moving down to Zanzibar, again from India, and also moving to Indonesia, where 100,000 people died during the 32 pandemic. Stop. Next slide, please. Having a ship called the Carrick out of Ireland arrived in Quebec, full of Irish people who both went to Canada and some went down to the 5 Points in New York, which at the time was full of Irish people. They brought cholera with them, and this spread right through the States and especially along the Oregon Trail. Next slide. And this is the appearance of the first patient, or reputed to be the first patient, a girl called Isabelle Hazard. Next slide, please. And this is how she appeared the following year in the February edition of the Lancet. In fact, she had died in November of 1831. The description of her at the time was that she was 12 years of age. She was from Low Street on the Fish Quay in Sunderland, where her parents ran a pub for ship workers. She was one of the first victims, attended church on Sunday, suddenly struck down with vomiting, torrents of watery diarrhea and unquenchable thirst. Her eyes became sunken in their sockets, her features were unrecognisable, her legs seized with terrible spasms, her pulses scarcely perceptible, and her whole body freezing. She died in a matter of hours. Next slide, please. There's some argument at the time whether this bug arrived in Sunderland first or whether it arrived in London. And the reason for that is that a sailor's body by the name of Pugh was found in the estuary in London in 1831, some 2 months before the episode in Sunderland. The problem at the time was that if cholera had arrived in London, this would cause huge economic disaster for the city, as quarantine measures had been put forward, and the local traders reckoned that this would actually cost a fortune. At the coroner's court, the coroner decided that, in fact, Pugh had died by a visitation from God, and this was the actual diagnosis that was put on it. But when brought to the Commons for debate, it was decided that because it was a visitation from God, this was related to deity and not for a common man to discuss, and therefore the outbreak of cholera was refused to be discussed in the Commons at the time. Going back to Sunderland, this was caused a similar problem where the local doctors refused to actually label Isabelle Hazard death as cholera for the same reasons, as they felt that this would bring the area to a complete standstill. But a doctor called Claney reported the case directly to the Department of Health. And this basically is why it was the first reported case in England. Coming back to Ireland at the same time, these bones that were unearthed, they were from a mass grave in what's now known as the Croppy's Acre in Dublin. Next slide, please. In the 1840s and 50s in Ireland, the famine basically was probably the biggest thing that people talk about, and people talk about people dying from starvation, etc. This was mainly a rural problem. The cities were spared, but in fact, in the case of cholera, it was the cities that were affected, and the rural areas were spared. Cholera was a major cause of death during the famine as well, as too as measles and chickenpox, typhus, and typhoid. There were previous famines in Ireland. There was a famine in 1817, followed by a second one in 1822, all of which are actually well documented in the Department of Records in the English Parliament. And this was put forward as a reason why people died of cholera in the 1832 outbreak. Next slide, please. With cholera, it was felt that you could be well at breakfast, start to have symptoms by lunch, and be dead by tea time. Next slide, please. Molly Malone, who most of us will sing about, who died of a fever, most likely died of typhoid rather than actually dying of cholera. In the previous 100 years to 1817, there were 6 typhoid epidemics. There was 4 chickenpox epidemics, and there was 7 measles epidemics in Ireland. Next slide, please. Because in 1817 the world became aware of cholera in India, and because of the 10,000 English soldiers that had actually died, general boards of health were set up in Ireland and England and in Scotland. The one in England consisted of 6 doctors taken from what they were titled as the 2 medical schools, i.e. Oxford and Cambridge, 5 soldiers and 1 parliamentarian. The General Board of Health was also set up in Dublin under the Marquess of Anglesey. This set up local boards of health, and their job was to set up cholera hospitals, of which there was 2 in Dublin. This went about street cleaning, whitewashing houses, fumigating rooms, washing furniture and bedding, etc. Contagious individuals were forcibly removed to fever hospitals, and in 1832, 148,013 shillings, or £13, 5 shillings and 7 pence in total was spent, which is a vast amount of money at that time. Next slide, please. The main place that cholera hit Dublin was actually down on the docks. Next slide. And this is the area. Around Townsend Street in Dublin, beside Trinity College at the moment. The Liffey was much wider then than it is now. Next slide, please. So cholera arrived in March. The Cholera Board met in 1832 in March, and the first case of cholera was reported in Waterford, in the south of the country, in 1832 in May. At the time, there was a light tax or window tax. Sorry, I'm losing slides. Yeah, you're back. Okay, sorry. Essentially, you had to pay for light and for having the number of windows in your house. And it wasn't only in Ireland, but in England as well. And it caused huge problems for people and bills, etc. It was decreed that the windows of the apartment should be thrown open and remain freely admitting air for at least 3 days. The affluent were told their best measure for safety was to provide for the poor because cholera struck all classes. Vagrants and beggars spread disease, and certain towns had special constables to stop them from entering the towns. Next slide, please. The 2 main hospitals were set up. There was one in Grange Gorman, and the second, which became a psychiatric hospital eventually, and the second was Townsend Street Depot Cholera Hospital. This is an example of the bills that they paid out for that year. They paid 39 shillings for leeches, 5 shillings for surgical instruments, and £3 for cupping instruments. They paid £1.12 for lancets and £193 for drugs and medicines, but with £8 going for lemons and oranges. Be pleased to hear that Arthur Guinness and Sons, James White and Kinnahan and Sons got 121 £1, 8 shillings and 1 penny for brandy and porter, but coffins cost £438 at the time. Next slide, please. The 2 major hospitals were set up by both the Mercy Nuns and the Charity Nuns, who both went on after this to form major units. The hospital in Townsend Street was set up by Catherine Macaulay, who went on to form the Sisters of Mercy and then the Mater Hospital. And Sister Mary Aikenhead set up the clinic in Grange Gorman. 2 of her notable students were Florence Nightingale and Mother Teresa later on. In fact, when Florence Nightingale went to Scutari, 11 nurses from the Mercy Order went with her. And the famous painting of Florence Nightingale with the lamp at Scutari, beside her is actually Sister Mary Clare of the Mercy Nuns. What's worth noting at the time was the leader of the Mercy Nuns at the time, the Sister Bridgman, fell out with Florence Nightingale and actually set up another hospital in Balaclava during that war. Next slide, please. Evan. There were other hospitals around at the time, including the fever hospitals, and the famous one was the Cork Street Fever Hospital, set up because of the typhoid and typhus epidemics of the previous 100 years. The board of the Cork Fever Hospital, which eventually actually only closed its doors in the 1920s, decided that they were not going to admit patients with cholera in case they put other patients at risk. A doctor at the time, who was one of the senior doctors at the time, Dr. Stokes, was forced to retire because he ignored this order and admitted patients anyway for treatment. This caused consternation in the south of the city, and there was public meetings held in support of Dr. Stokes, but he wasn't reinstated. Next slide. The treatment at the time was a form of benevolent homicide. To counter persistent vomiting, the physician came to the aid of nature by administering emetics. They exacerbated the intractable diarrhea that was rapidly dehydrating the sufferer of his vital fluids by drastic purgatives. They used leeches and lancets for bleeding, and they treated them with opium, brandy, calamine, rhubarb, and ginger. And to make matters worse, they used cold water baths or brine baths as well. Next slide, please. Around the same time in Scotland, and John talked about it last year, we had Burke and Hare. And Burke and Hare used to rob graves for bodies for medical students. Next slide, please. John last week showed a picture of Greyfriars Cemetery in Edinburgh, which bars across the graves. But in fact, the other thing that was set up in most of the graveyards in Ireland, England, Scotland, and Wales were very high walls associated with round towers, of which there were guards at night to stop people entering the graves. Next slide. Because of the medical students and because of the theory that essentially doctors were trying to learn their trade by cutting up bodies, rumours went around not just in Liverpool, but also in Paris and again in Hamburg, that in fact doctors were killing patients and that cholera didn't really exist. And it was only made up by the medical fraternity to get bodies. Sounds a little bit familiar to what's happening at the moment. And there were major riots. Next slide. There were major riots, especially in England, in Liverpool there, but also, as I said, in Paris and in Germany. And doctors were actually killed during these riots. Next slide, please. The main theory for cholera at the time was the miasmic theory, which essentially, next slide, that the bug was carried on the air, and it was more the way the wind was blowing that actually caused the problem rather than anything else. In a way, we kind of think of this ourselves. Everybody knows that in winter, when the wind blows from the north, you get the flu. And everybody knows in autumn that you actually get things like diarrhea because the wind is blowing from the east. And during the summer, you get other bugs because the wind is blowing in different directions. And this was simply a reaction to what people thought was actually happening. This picture, while they're actually talking about what was happening in Ireland, is actually a painting of the war between the Poles and the Russians, and the fact that so many were dying during that war of cholera. Next slide, please. They often found, as this slide from Egypt shows, that you actually went to a funeral, but in fact you came back in a coffin. Again, from the crowd effects of the funeral themselves. Next slide, please. And because of the feeling that this bug was carried on the air, people resorted to having large fires, firing cannon shot into the air on an hourly basis. Next slide. And wearing all sorts of charms to try and keep the bug away. Next slide, please. The rich people decided to move as far away as possible from the poor people. The problem was the water supply stayed the same. And in this case, you find that people who actually moved upriver but having the same water supply, they still managed to die from cholera. Next slide, please. William Brooke O'Shaughnessy was an Irish doctor, and depending what journal you read, he either came from Ennis, County Limerick, or from Limerick, County Clare, depending on what journal you actually read about him. But he had an important part to play in all this. Born in, we will say, in either Limerick or Clare anyway, he originally went to school in Trinity, but finished his education in Edinburgh. Next slide, please. And he looked at this blue epidemic of cholera, and his major finding was the fact that essentially that the biochemistry of the stools was different, that essentially that these patients were losing salt and losing bicarbonate in their stools. And he felt that what was needed at the time was some way of actually getting this back into the patients. Next slide, please. Around the same time, a Dr. William Stevens, in the Coldbath Field prisons in England, reported that when he injected saline, now he was using small quantities of 1 to 3 ounces of saline. When he injected this into patients, and he had 200 patients that he reported on, that only 1 in 30 died, as opposed to 50% mortality generally from this. But Barry, who went to investigate St. Petersburg, and O'Shaughnessy both refuted this paper. Stop. Next one, please. But just like today, you get an epidemic, and what happens is the journals are literally filled. And this is what happened here. Next slide. That the journals were full of comments on a weekly basis from various hospitals, including the Cholera Hospital on Townsend Street in Dublin, either agreeing with the treatment or disagreeing with the treatment. Next slide, please. William Stevens, basically, he made his name already looking at the colour of blood from yellow fever patients and found that it was darker than normal. And he felt that if you could restore the red colour by administering oral solutions, or non-purgative neutral salts, as he put it, that essentially you could actually do a lot for these patients. And he tried this both orally and IV, talking about some type of oral rehydration therapy. He wasn't so much interested in actually rehydrating the patient, but restoring the red colour of the blood. Next slide, please. And this is the book that he wrote at the time, which caused great consternation. The biggest problem was that he actually went to medical school in the Caribbean, and unfortunately, as stated earlier, the two medical schools of England, i.e. Cambridge and Oxford, did not see him as an expert, and I think largely for that reason. Next slide, please. We're back to William Brooke O'Shaughnessy, and he kept pushing this theory that essentially if you actually use saline salts, but he talked about using nitrous chloride rather than sodium chloride, but he also uses potassium as well to replace the fluids, that essentially this might work. Next slide, please. And he was one of the first to talk about extracellular fluid and intracellular fluid and the difference between them, and the importance of rehydration and using perhaps some type of IV method of doing it. Next slide. So a doctor in Scotland called Dr. Latta decided, well, this might be worth trying. So next slide. But the only way of giving fluids at the time was to use what was known as a reed syringe. Now, a reed syringe could be used as a breast pump. It could be used to administer an enema. It could be used to give an enema of tobacco smoke. But what Latta did was he connected this to the external jugular, and he injected 1 to 6 ounces of saline into several patients, reporting initial response. Unfortunately, all his patients died, but they all seemed to get better first. As regards the enema of tobacco smoke, this was a well recognised and written up in the Lancet paper on how to revive somebody who had drowned in the Thames, that essentially giving enemas of tobacco smoke was meant to revive them. Next slide, please. So Latta and Shaughnessy, basically at the time, they talked about essentially this large proportion of water that seemed to be missing, and they suggested replacing it with deficient saline. And Latta tried this then in 1832 with some dramatic effects. Next slide, please. So we come to this guy. Oh, sorry. Next slide, please. This guy, Jon Snow. Okay, Jon Snow is probably more famous for being the father of anesthetics, but from this point of view, we're going to talk about him as the father of epidemiology. Stop. Born in York at the turn of the 19th century, he was originally apprenticed out to a doctor at the age of 14. Having done his apprenticeship, he moved from York up to London, where he managed to get his degree. His certification in the College of Surgeons, and a PhD, all within 12 months. Next slide, please. He had a practice close to Broad Street. Now, Broad Street was an area in the middle of Soho that had a huge epidemic of cholera. Next slide, please. And what's worth noting in this slide, basically, is the date of August. And in this situation, they're talking about the pump being the area that was causing all the problems. Next slide. But what John did was he actually looked at the cases of cholera, and he discovered that most of them around a particular pump. There was 4 other pumps in the area, and there was very few cases around this. Okay. There was 2 areas though of concern. One was there was a workhouse, and the second was there was a brewery. The workhouse didn't use water from this pump, even though it could have. It had a pump of its own. And when he actually talked to the brewery, he found that essentially nobody drank water in the brewery; they all drank beer. So there was no danger of them catching cholera from that. There was one other case at the time which needed some explaining, and that was Susanna Eli. Now, Susanna Eli lived in Hampstead, which was many miles from Soho, and it was hard to explain how she managed to fit into this whole thing. Until talking to her sons, they discovered that essentially they used to work in the brewery and would collect water from this pump because it was meant to be very nice water to drink. Next slide, please. So having done his research, Jon Snow took the handle off this, and the epidemic seemed to disappear. Next slide, please. The argument, though, is whether taking the handle off made a big difference because it seemed to be waning anyway, but there was still some cases involved. Next slide. But the pump or the replica of the pump is still there in Broad Street in Soho if you want to visit today. And that pub in the corner is actually a museum related to the pub. Next slide, please. The real epidemiology at the time goes to a priest at the time, Reverend Henry Whitehead, who was the priest of that local area, who went around and talked to all the inhabitants of Broad Street, and having met the mother of who he thought was the first case, and Isabelle, no, wrong one, and Elizabeth Lewis. And they found that essentially she had actually thrown this baby's diapers and her dead husband's clothes into a cesspit at the bottom of the garden, and this cesspit actually had leaked into the water of this. So a combination of Whitehead's epidemiology and Jon Snow's chasing of this seemed to actually figure out exactly what was happening, that it was an organism that was waterborne that was causing the problems. Next slide, please. Moving on from there, okay, Edwin Chadwick in 1842 gave a report on the sanitation conditions of labouring politicians in Great Britain, and this brought about a Public Health Act which looked at new sanitation and water supplies for Ireland and England. Next slide, please. In terms of public health, the miasma theory wasn't an obstacle, since removing the smells requiring sewage disposal and a clean water supply. So they did all the right things for all the wrong reasons. Next slide, please. Coco Chanel basically said that success is often achieved by those who don't know that failure is inevitable. And that's probably why most of this actually worked. Next slide. So as regards cholera in 1832, it saw the introduction of oral rehydration therapy, even though it probably wasn't recognised at the time. IV fluids were used for the first time, and for use for some years before it was decided they just would never work. The true biochemistry of cholera was recognised. Epidemiology and evidence-based medicine was started, and the nursing orders of both the Mercy and the charity nurses actually started as well. The public health scheme as we know it was introduced, and sanitation and town planning was brought in by Farr in 1866. Thomas Latta died of TB in 1833, and William Stevens died insolvent in the 1890s. William Brooke O'Shaughnessy, who was either from Limerick or Clare, whichever, was knighted for his service to India, having brought telegraphy there, but was a great advocate medically afterwards for the medicinal use of cannabis. Next slide, please. In 1958, the active absorption of glucose, absorption of sodium were interdependent, and sodium absorption enhanced by glucose was actually noted. By 1962, Phillips first established that IV solutions could restore circulating blood volume and electrolyte deficits in patients with dehydrating cholera. In 1968, the bowel-stimulating cholera toxin was discovered. And in 1972, the cholera toxin was shown to stimulate small bowel to secrete large quantities of sodium and potassium. By 1985, careful clinical trials proved that oral rehydration therapy actually did work and would reduce infant mortality. And in 1994, Fisher and Parsons discovered the mechanism for glucose transport in the gut, which is the one thing that was missing in the IV fluids that was purported before. While they were using saline, there was no sugar, there was no dextrose in their solutions. Next slide, please. So IV therapy, as we know it, even though in this slide looks quite ancient, was brought into play. Next slide, please. And as regards the goat, well, there's many ways to bring him to market, and this is basically, as opposed to tying him to the side of the cart, this is probably the way to do it. So next slide. So we go back to William Stoker. Now, William Stoker, essentially, there's different stories about William Stoker in the end, but his son's cousin essentially used to hear stories from William Stoker's son about the bloodletting of William Stoker in the treatment of cholera patients. Next slide, please. His mother actually came from Sligo and told stories of the deaths from cholera which raged throughout the town in 1832. Next slide, please. So he wrote a book called Dracula, which actually is meant to be based on the dead bodies and the people dying in relation to that. So next slide. So we'll leave the last comment from him, that you don't learn really from success, you only learn from failure. And this was Bram Stoker. And Bram Stoker's brother, Abraham Stoker, was probably one of the most famous neurosurgeons of his era. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. Hi, Martin, are you awake?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you very much, Professor Fox. That was fantastic. What a great run through a hugely important problem in the Middle Ages and even now. It's a miracle that mankind has survived at all, given the onslaught of so many infectious diseases that we have faced throughout our evolution. I just wonder, when was the cholera organism, Vibrio cholera, actually identified? Because this was happening quite frequently with various epidemics in the mid-1800s, and yet Lister was only becoming to terms around 1850 or so with the identification of bacteria as the cause of suppuration in at that time, amputations. So when did it actually happen that the organism, I might miss this in your talk?
Yeah, no, it was Filipino who actually discovered it in the 1870s. In the 1870s, he wasn't recognized until the 1960s. In fact, they did find organisms. They were looking down microscopes. There's a guy called Butt, who was looking down microscopes in London, even as far back as 1817, before the outbreak actually came, before the outbreak came to London. That essentially that he was looking at it back then, and he was reporting these microorganisms that he was seeing, but he didn't know what they were. Now the problem was that at the time the Thames was known as the Great Stink of London, essentially, and God knows what was in it from that point of view. And the big problem was that people seriously didn't believe the whole miasma theory, and most cities, most countryside stank. This was the whole point. And the whole theory was you got away from the stink and therefore you were healthy from that point of view. And if you take the simple understanding that if the wind is blowing from a certain direction, as we get normally in the various seasons of the year, you get certain diseases. You can understand where the theory come from, including your mother telling you basically that you don't take your coat off till after May, because essentially you will get the flu, or you'll get a cold in your kidneys or something. Yeah.
Indeed. Professor Flood, I think, is online now. He's had some technical difficulties. Can I turn you over as he is moderating the rest of the session? Are you there, John?
No,
John?
I don't.
No. Okay, he's posted a question, which I'll read for you. Were there any cholera cases in Galway and Limerick, as there were major ports at the time? That's one. How effective were the army doctors in the cholera epidemic in the army? And does boiling water kill the organism? If so, I presume drinking unboiled water is the way it was transmitted. Okay,
so basically, was it in Galway? Yes.
Galway and Limerick, yeah.
And it was majorly in Limerick. There was huge outbreak in Limerick, an absolutely enormous outbreak in Limerick and Sligo. Sligo was a huge army depot at the time. Limerick was as well. Essentially, so there was huge outbreaks in both those areas. Army doctors reported what was happening, essentially, especially in India, where I said that within weeks of the first outbreak, 10,000 soldiers had died in India. Okay, the big problem really though was that essentially the major step forward as regards hospitalization essentially came from the nurses. And while Florence Nightingale has this reputation of the lady with the lamp, in fact, when you chase it, it is more to do with Bridgman and Mary Clare, and what they did both in Scutari and in Balaclava, and setting up the hospitals there, the sanitations. They were actually sent out by the Prime Minister of England for the work they had already done both in Townsend Street and in Grange Gorman. Mm. And the Prime Minister overrode Florence Nightingale to send them out. He didn't want them out there from that. As regards water, yeah, boiled water basically was better. The big problem, what was put down originally, and I suppose the big doctors at the time were actually the Indian doctors, rather than the military doctors. The Indian doctors were already on the ball. They actually knew that there was a problem, probably not with the water. They were actually blaming the rice that was cooked in the water for causing the problem, rather than the water itself.
I worked in Africa for a while, and I did come across a minor cholera epidemic, and we didn't lose any patients. We made our own IV fluids, but it was very, 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 very fast, complete and utter dehydration, and the whole cut of the mattress and the bucket underneath it, and rice water stools, all of that, classic. The RCSI have some research experience and projects in looking at solar sterilization in plastic bottles. So water that's perhaps not very clean can be sterilized if left out in the open through plastic in a plastic bottle. What's your feeling about that, Professor Fox?
But that'd be certainly worth looking at. I mean, especially, but I mean, it's getting the plastic out of the areas you need it.
There must be a problem with plastic too, yeah. Well, when was the last cholera epidemic in Dublin? Around the 50s, I think, wasn't it?
There was cases in the 50s. There was cases in the 50s. I mean, the strange thing when you look at Robert Peel, the guy he was Prime Minister of England around it's the turn of the 19th century. He was the guy who set up the Royal Society for Protection of Cruelty to Animals. He was from Galway. He had a house in Galway, Ballinhinch Castle. essentially was where he lived, essentially. But when he was Prime Minister, he made speeches about the fact that the reason people were dying of cholera and dying of the epidemics was the unemployment, the starvation in Ireland, and the famines that actually were occurring in Ireland right through the 17th century, the 18th century, never mind the 19th century ones that became famous from that point.
I think one of the features from your talk is the importance of observation, and I think Jon Snow made wonderful observations about the incidents in that area.
Yeah.
Fascinating. And I think perhaps he deserves more than most the accolade for the most significant contribution to the early prevention of cholera.
Yeah, and the fact that and what he did as well with anaesthetics. The terrible thing about it was he was actually only recognised for what he did in 1858, and he promptly died 2 weeks after the Royal Society recognised him.
Okay. Professor Flood has one other comment, and we'll have to end it up with this one. How often do you get typhoid and cholera together?
Typhoid and cholera together, I would say fairly frequently, because again you get the same kind of scenarios that you have at the moment. You get war zones, you've got dehydration, you've got malnutrition, you've poor water supplies. Essentially, you're going to get them both together, just like you're going to get measles, chickenpox, etc. as well. Okay, again, what they talked about in the famine, the big famine in Ireland, essentially, very few people actually died of starvation. They died of the infections. They died of the infections associated with it.
Okay. I just want to thank you, Professor Fox, for a really enlightening and knowledgeable presentation. It's clear that you have other interests apart from pediatrics, and I thank you for a wonderful presentation. I'd like to thank Nevin, Fauzia, Celine and Victoria for their patience and expertise in putting this together and enabling us to talk to you from Bahrain. The next talk will be by Professor Flood next week on medical practice in the ancient world. You can also see that we have some exciting topics coming up. The history of surgery by Professor Walsh. What can we learn about disease and paleopathology from Professor Flood? Then medicine and the Holocaust from Dr. Finola Goff, and finally the history of medicine in the Arab world. I'd like you to take note of all these and perhaps invite your friends. We're happy to have everyone, including the public, join these sessions. So from Bahrain, thank you very much. Stay safe and stay well. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.